Good evening. In the next couple of minutes, I would like to share with you how, in our climate crisis, we can turn despair into hope and action. I am a researcher who day in, day out is looking at climate change. And you might expect that I would have grown used to the alarming headlines about climate change. But that's not true. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, I was having breakfast, drinking my coffee, and I read this article. Climate change has brought on floods, droughts, and led to more crop failure. In the last 3 years, the number of people going hungry has increased again. People are already suffering from climate change today. And as I was reading this, I had to think, how will our world look like in 30 years? When the earth is even hotter, when there's maybe 1 billion more mouths to feed. Climate change is sometimes very depressing. Melting ice caps, rising sea levels, coral bleaching, forest fires. And these are just some of the many dimensions of climate change that make me sometimes feel very weak, vulnerable, and helpless. Deep in me, I feel a despair, which is maybe like fish caught in a net. And these fish, they know that they're in a bad place. They want to escape. They swim up and down, left and right, but there is no way out. Or is there? Reading all these headlines, it might be easy to imagine a future of climate doom. But is it possible to imagine the opposite? A world in which we have reined in greenhouse gases, in which we no longer emit the gases that harm our climate and our planet? Let's try. Let's close our eyes and imagine 40 years from now. You wake up, have breakfast. What is on your plate? After breakfast, you go to work. But how do we move around in this world? And maybe after work we go back to home. How do we heat our homes? Now, some of you can imagine and can think of a picture of how this zero emissions world could look like. But I have talked to business leaders and representatives of workers, and it turns out they find it really difficult to imagine this future. Because how can you produce, how can you trade and transport products without leaving a trace of emissions? And yet, that is exactly what our governments have committed to when they closed the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015. They agreed that we have to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius, and they also agreed that by the second half of our century, we need to have a net zero emissions economy. These are great, ambitious goals, aren't they? The trouble is, however, that if you look at governments, they are not really walking the talk. Even if they implement all their policies, at the end of our century, we might still be looking at 3 degrees, a 3 degrees warmer world, or even 4 degrees. And that is disastrous. But here's the good news. Outside governments, many stakeholders are stepping up with climate actions. Businesses, investors, NGOs, cities and regions, indigenous peoples, students, young and old. They commit to reduce emissions. They help their communities to adapt to climate change. And sometimes they also pressure their governments into taking more effective and better actions on climate change. And sometimes there's this rare positive news about climate change. And almost always it is about these actors standing up, committing to action. For instance, this is the city of Banja Luka in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And Banja Luka has piloted a project to refurbish, to retrofit its 35-year-old local district heating system. And in that, they achieve more than 90% reduction in emissions. And Banja Luka is only one of 9,000 cities, more than 9,000 cities around the world that are taking action and commit to taking action. Companies have also stepped up in a major way. You might know a furnishing giant called IKEA. IKEA already invested more than €1.5 billion in renewable energy. And it is only one of more than 150 of the world's largest companies to transition to 100% renewable energy. Now, all these actions, they do amount to something. Their potential is enormous. For instance, those 9,000 cities I was just talking about, together, they could save the amount of emissions equal to what Germany emits every year, twice, by 2030. Another recent study that looks at partnerships between industry, governments, NGOs, even concludes that these type of actions have so much potential that they could even put us back on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But there's a big if. And that if is if everyone keeps its promise. If commitments are kept. In my previous research, I looked at all types of stakeholders committing to sustainable development. And one thing that I found was a lot of these promises remained promises on paper, almost half of them. So when I see this groundswell of climate action, on the one hand, I can be very enthusiastic about it, but I'm also a little bit worried. Aren't we creating an alternate reality based on what we think what might happen if everyone keeps its promise? When and think that we are on track when we're really far off track. So one day, I sat down behind my computer and I started just to write out all these commitments all these stakeholders that make promises to take climate action. And I started collecting information on them, what they have produced, what activities they have done, trying to see whether they are making progress. And together with colleagues, we made this a much bigger database. And one of the things we found, for instance, is these climate initiatives, they are becoming more effective over time. Now, that in itself is encouraging. However, in some parts of the world, we see hardly any activities. In some developing countries, for instance, that need climate action so badly, that are already hit by climate change so hard. In some sectors, these actions are underperforming. So I talked to other colleagues and I found out that they were equally concerned as I to make sure that commitments are kept, that the potential of climate action is maximized. And together we formed a network and we amplified our voices. We knocked on the doors of policymakers, offering our advice, telling them it's great that there's all this action, but sometimes actions are not so effective, and sometimes more help is needed. I think ours is just one example of a climate action that is maybe not led by a big company or by a city. It can start very small, and in a way, we can all be part of climate action. Nowadays, it is so easy to show our concern about climate change and other global challenges. I learned a word, it's slacktivism. It's from behind your computer, you can, at the click of a button, share your concern, share articles and post things on your timeline, retweet, etc. The great thing is that this way, we all get to learn about climate change and the awareness grows of climate change impacts. But there's also a downside to it. As we learn more about climate change, it might be that we feel more desperate, feel a greater despair, even grow depressed. And we really need to get from slacktivism to activism to set ourselves free. Now remember this picture. How would these fish ever break free? I don't know whether you have heard about this movie from 2009 called Finding Nemo. Now, Finding Nemo is the main character. He's a little clownfish, and he fits right through the maze. And bravely he swims into the maze, and he talks to the fish. He spreads the word, swim down. Swim down. And all these fish, simultaneously, they swim down and they exert so much force that they sink the fishing boat and they set themselves free and into the wide ocean they go freely. In a way, we have to free ourselves from the net of despair. We have to cast away the despair and the seeming inevitability of a climate catastrophe. And how do we do that? Maybe you live in one of those more than 9,000 cities in the world that have promised to take action. Get together and raise your voices and demand from your city governments concrete plans to keep their promises. Or maybe you work and live in a place that has not even thought about climate action yet. A good example to follow maybe then to look at the students around the world who are petitioning their universities to put their money into renewable energy instead of fossil fuel. They call that divestment. And although divestment and the amounts are relatively small still compared to the size of the world economy, this might be the beginning of major shifts where we see trillions of money shifting towards a new zero carbon, zero emissions economy. So get together with your friends, with your colleagues, with your schoolmates. And you can demand more action from schools, from universities, from cities, from businesses. And maybe you can become the action, part of the action yourself. By doing this, we might avert a climate catastrophe. But maybe even more inspiring, one day we might look back and we found out that not only have we avoided a climate catastrophe, but we have conquered despair. We have replaced despair by hope. Thank you.